We are recording, and now I'm going to mute all. Okay, good evening. There may still be a few people who will join. Just a little bit of housekeeping. In recent years, we've had fairly minimal pre-Pesach Shiurim because people don't come to them. And the reason they don't come to them is because they're the same every year. And after a while, the same share year after year becomes rather uninteresting, and people always are welcome to ask questions. This year, however, life is rather different. It's not just the peculiarities of the lockdown remains and the inconvenience and isolation that causes. That's slightly easier than last year. But because for the first time in 13 years, erev Pesach falls on Shabbos. Now, there are 4 possible start dates, days in the week of Pesach. Pesach can start on a Tuesday, Thursday, Shabbos, and they are the most common combinations. But it can also start on a Sunday, which of course means the erev Pesach on Shabbos. The calendar so works that is by far the least common option. Very unusually in the 2000s, it occurred 3 times in 2001, 2005, and 2008. Before that, not since 1994. It will happen again in 4 years, in 2025, and then not again until 2045, the 20-year gap, and a little longer. There can be even longer gaps. And the reason for this is there are a fixed number of days, just about, between Simchas Torah and Pesach, which obviously vary with the leap year, and also depend on how many days there are in the adjustable months of Kislev and Teves. And since there is a principle, lo odu Rosh, that Rosh Hashanah can't begin on a Sunday, Wednesday, or Friday, the combination of these factors means that many of the permutations in the calendar that would result on Pesach starting on a Sunday can't happen. And the outcome of that is that rarely, certainly it's something like once in 9 or 10 years, taken over a century, does erev Pesach fall on Shabbos. And some people find this to be a pain, others find it to be wonderful, because can you imagine you have an entire day before the Seder that you can't actually do anything very much? You can rest, sleep, enjoy family time. Others take a rather different view. I'm not going to take a vote as to whether you like it this way. There's not really much option. It is what it is. A few weeks ago, I spoke to Diane Gelly about this matter, and he said he didn't really understand why people made such a big deal out of it, and he tried in one sentence to summarize what was required. I was quite amenable to this approach. However, I reminded him that since it hadn't happened for 13 years, at least half of the rabbinate had never been in post while this had occurred, and there was a degree of anxiety among my colleagues. This is actually my 4th time as community rabbi with erev Pesach falling on Shabbos, the 3rd at Dunstan Road, and 1 in my previous community in Ilford, and so I have some experience in this. Now, you will have either seen or will see this piece of paper. It has come in your mailing. It's also available from the shul website. If you have not got one, you can download it. Just also a reminder that we are trying for all sorts of reasons to reduce paper wastage. So we do send mail outs, but these documents are available from the shul website. It means you should send your sale of Comets form in, take an image and send it by WhatsApp or email, fill it out, send it by email. If you can't do that, send me the details by email. We are trying to avoid lots of paper postage and wastage. It worked quite well last year and it's working well this year. It also means that we've now set up an online donation system. So if you would like to give to the Pesach Fund to enable others in the community and beyond who are struggling financially to celebrate Pesach, please do so, and the money will be distributed in the usual way. But we are again trying the combination of improved practice, accountability, and also to avoid unnecessary handling and passing of items, to do it as much as possible electronically. So with that said, let's talk about what happens in erev Pesach falls on Shabbos. I can talk about the usual Pesach things. I've got lists of pages and pages of notes from previous years, but I want to address this primarily because this is how Pesach this year differs from other years, and the 25 of you or so who have joined and presumably have done so when previously 3 people turned up is because they want to hear about this. So this is something which my mother would say people make a bit of a matzo pudding out of, which is, I think, quite appropriate for the occasion. And is really rather simple. And it's simple because of various changes to the way we live. If you look in the Mishnah and in the Gemara and in the codes, it's very complicated. You have to kind of cook your Comets food and scrape out your utensils in a particular way and then set them aside. Enormously complicated, reflected the fact that people had few utensils, didn't live in a relatively spacious and comfortable life circumstances that we have. And more crucially, washing up facilities were much more limited, and a product that we know as egg matzo or matzo ashira, while theoretically known, was never commercially produced, which it has been in previous years. And I will speak more about that as we go on. Here is a brief outline, and really, I think the entire thing needn't take more than about 10 minutes, and I'm happy to take questions. It's based on the sheet. There are numerous books, pamphlets, articles about this subject. So every time erev Pesach falls on Shabbos, there are new works that appear. There's actually a very, very short guide that was published by a based in Bnei Brak in the 1950s, which is excellent. It's completely free of any nonsense or humras, and I've based my notes on that. I found, would you believe, there's a Hasidic halachist who's written 30 books called Gavriel Sinner. I have his books on the disc. He has written a book on this subject. It is 350 pages. So I hope you don't mind. I'm now going to read it to you before we continue. So I have no idea what you can say in 350 pages about a subject that I've managed to get into one page, but I will leave it to your imagination. We end up, of course, with erev Pesach being a day which is very different from other years, and therefore all of the activities that we normally do in the lead out to Pesach being pushed back by one day. The very small and not terribly interesting details are for technical reasons. The fast of the firstborn is normally held on erev Pesach. Once we're not holding on erev Pesach, we don't need to do it on Friday either. It's held on Thursday. That means for those who would normally participate, the siyum will be after Shacharis on Thursday morning, and it will be available by Zoom. If for some reason I forget to turn the Zoom on, someone send me a message or phone me until they make sure it comes on, because I know there are people who would like to participate remotely. The Zoom will be at approximately, I would guess approximately 7:40 if you're not there in person, and so that is it. Now, of course, that's the 12th of Nisan. The fast. The next day, Friday, is erev Shabbos, and it's not erev Pesach. We could call it pseudo erev Pesach if you like, but it's going to be treated in many regards as erev Pesach, and that means, yes, you will be included in the siyum if you're on Zoom. I'm offering it because it's possible to be included. Yes, it's an acceptable way to participate in the siyum. Because while a Kaddish is customarily said afterwards, does not require one to be present at a minyan. Yes, it's fine to participate in Zoom if you can't come in person. So, Steve, I hope that answers your question. Now, the search for Comets and the destruction of Comets are normally conducted on the night of erev Pesach and in the morning. That's Shabbos, so everything's taken back by one day. That means the normal search for Comets is done at nightfall on Thursday evening. The timings are printed. However, when it comes to the next morning, it's not actually erev Pesach, and there's no prohibition. In fact, it's permitted to eat Comets for the whole of Friday and until the actual time of prohibition, which is around 10 a.m. on Shabbos morning. So it's on Shabbos, and so one does not necessarily have to get rid of all the Comets. So you will notice that if you've read it, that the sale of Comets document that I have provided, that many of you have already completed, says, unlike in other years, that this includes all Comets in my possession, except for that which I plan to eat on Friday and have set aside for the Shabbos meals, for reasons which I'm now sure is obvious. That text does not normally appear in the document, because in a regular year, when erev Pesach is on Monday, Wednesday, or Friday, there's no need for it to do so. So one effectively treats Friday as though we're erev Pesach. One does preparations for the Seder because one will want to begin the Seder on Saturday night as promptly as possible. And there are certain things that you can't do on Shabbos. You can't really do anything on Shabbos. You don't want to have to start roasting eggs and bones and grating horseradish. These things can all be done on Friday. Just a word about horseradish. The horseradish has to, if you use horseradish, it has to be reasonably pungent to make sure it's wrapped well or put in an airtight tub once it has been grated. But all of those Seder preparations, as much as possible, should be done on Friday. And when it comes to destroying the Comets, of course, there's a discussion amongst the authorities about when you should destroy the Comets. It's not erev Pesach. There's no prohibition of eating Comets. And so the time, 11, 12 o'clock, is not really relevant. However, the consensus is to avoid confusion on subsequent years when we all have faulty memories and we think, oh, last year, I think we did it in the afternoon. We did it just before the end of the day. To avoid that happening next year, the normal practice is, if at all possible, to destroy the Comets at the same time that one would have done on any other year. So the time is printed. I've got it in front of me. I think it's about 11 o'clock. Remember, this is just before the clocks change. Most years it's an hour later because the clocks have not yet changed, because Pesach falls in March this year. And so what most people will do at this stage is keep some Comets back for Shabbos meals, and we'll discuss that in a moment. I've already mentioned preparations. The remaining thing to say about this Friday is the sale of Comets. So the sale of Comets again takes place at the same kind of time of day as it would normally take place, which is around 11 a.m., even though we're acknowledging it's permitted to own and use Comets for a further day. Again, that's to make sure that things are done in a regular, ordered way and there aren't confusions on subsequent years. But again, the purchaser will be advised that the sale excludes items that will still be needed on Friday and Shabbos, which means if you want to have a sandwich for lunch, this is all fine. However, common sense is needed here, because it's not very easy to dispose of Comets once Shabbos begins. The normal burning, these kind of things, it's not easy to get rid of it. So we want to only keep back a very small quantity. You'll do the normal burning of Comets at about 11 o'clock on Friday morning, and any Comets that's retained should be very, very small quantities. We may work out how much we're going to eat over Shabbos, more of that in a moment, but the amount that's going to be disposed of on Shabbos should be very, very small. And I'm not making this up, but I do recall it must have been, I reckon, 2001, it might even have been 94, discussing a very severe plumbing crisis that was caused in someone's home, who didn't really understand that when we say tiny amounts, we mean just a few crumbs, just a small amount to flush down the loo, which for us is the equivalent of washing it down a drain, which is what people used to do. That's fine. But I can assure you that if you try to flush large lumps of challah, this happens every time. People get nervous, they don't leave enough, they think they haven't left enough over the Shabbos meals, they leave too much over, and they're trying desperately to get rid of this Comet before the Zman. You will regret it. The plumbers are waiting to take your money off you for massive plumbing emergencies created by fools trying to flush challahs down the toilet on Saturday morning. Do not be one of these people. Make sensible preparations and keep only, I intend to take 10 very, very tiny pieces. The entire lot will be no more than a quarter of a slice of bread. Tiny pieces, so that it can simply be wrapped in a piece of tissue paper and flushed down the loo on Shabbos morning without any ceremony and without any angst, and most certainly without any blockages. And I recommend you do something very similar. That will be set aside in the normal way, together with whatever food you're going to eat on Shabbos. So we finish with Friday. Now, there are a number of complications about this Shabbos erev Pesach, and they are A, what one should eat, and B, what one does about davening. Here is the problem, and this is a very peculiarly Ashkenazi problem, for reasons I will explain. If you are a Sephardi, you have a much easier time of this, and the reasons as follows, which is that it is not permitted to eat matzah on erev Pesach. That is going to be the Shabbos of my subject of my Shabbos. God will drosh it in detail, which is it will be available at Shul on Shabbos afternoon, and there'll be a pre-recorded version, which I've already recorded, actually circulated after Shabbos. It's not permitted to eat matzah on erev Pesach, and while technically, probably you can eat matzah at the evening meal and not during the day. In practice, no one does. And in fact, many people have a custom, it's not a halachic requirement, to avoid eating matzah from Rosh Chodesh Nisan or even from Purim. And there's no reason not to honor those customs. And that means you can't eat matzah for your Shabbos meals. But you also can only eat Comets until 10 o'clock and not afterwards, which clashes with the normal time when people have a Shabbos lunch. And it's not just a question of fulfilling the obligation to eat a Shabbos meal. It's going to be a long time to the Seder. You need to make sure you eat during the day. Otherwise, one will not be ready. It's not appropriate to not eat from early in the morning. I'll be very hungry. It spoils the Seder. So also, it's not easy to dispose of Comets, to wash up Comets dishes, and these things, there are a lot of competing complications. And the way it's cast in the early halachic sources is quite complicated and really can all be avoided by the operation of one of two simple options. Many people still want to eat bread. Now, you can, if you wish, eat bread, but you clearly, in your freshly cleaned space for Pesach, and with the difficulties of getting rid of things, it's very unwise just to have a kind of a willy-nilly arrangement. And so the recommendation is, if you want to eat bread, then you should use pitta. Pitta does not leave crumbs. You can allocate one pitta per person or whatever quantity is appropriate to make sure that you don't have large numbers of pittas left over, which you then can't get rid of, or you have to eat far more than you want. And you will make hamotzi on the pitta far from your Shabbos table. Shabbos table will be laid with Pesach utensils. The food will be cooked in Pesach dishes, and it will be Pesach-dik food. You'll eat the bread away from the table. Make sure you brush yourself down so you don't bring crumbs to the table. Keep any remnants from the bread in a bag to be flushed away on Shabbos morning, and you will do that for both Shabbos meals. That is option one. Option two is something which was not really available generally, because something called matzah ashira, technically enriched matzah, is commercially available. It's actually quite popular. And this is where the difference comes. Ashkenazim do not eat matzah ashira on Pesach, except where there's a health issue, whereas most Sfaradim do eat it. And therefore, even though matzah ashira, it's the Pesach equivalent of mazonos bread, if that makes any sense. It is a grain that is kneaded not with water, but with a mixture of fruit juice or egg and so on. That's why it's colloquially called egg matzah, but in halacha it's called matzah ashira, which is enriched. Now, the halacha, the Mishnah talk about it as a theoretical construct, but I can't imagine the Mishnah ever imagined, certainly before machines were invented, that everyone would actually make this in any quantity, but it's very easy. And whenever erev Pesach falls on Shabbos, matzah ashira is manufactured in much larger quantity because the manufacturers know that there is a larger demand for people who are going to do what I'm about described. Because matzah ashira does not qualify as matzah for the purposes of the Seder, according to almost all halachis, it does not fall into the prohibition of eating matzah on erev Pesach, because it's not actually matzah for this purpose. The matzah you can't eat on erev Pesach or in the lead up to Pesach to ensure that you eat at the Seder when you do the mitzvah with some kind of appetite, obviously only applies to matzah with which you could fulfill the mitzvah. And therefore, matzah ashira, enriched matzah, does not qualify, and it is permitted to eat it on erev Pesach. So this is where the difference between Ashkenazim and Sfaradim come in. Because Ashkenazim are very strict not to eat matzah ashira on Pesach or even after the time of prohibition at 10 o'clock, it still means that the second Shabbos meal in the morning has to be early. For Sfaradim who do eat matzah ashira during Pesach, there is really no reason not to have the second Shabbos meal much later in the day as normal, and that also, of course, has impact on what time their shul services will be. But having acknowledged that, and reckoning, of course, there are always some Sfaradim online listening, thinking, we've got it easy, another Pesach thing that the Ashkenazim are mad about, but okay, that's how it is. We're going to go now with the normative Ashkenazi practice, having acknowledged that Sfaradim can do this differently. And so the benefits of matzah ashira are manifest. It is technically Pesach-dik. There is no issue at all of eating on your Pesach utensils. If you want to be frum about it, brush it away afterwards. You don't have to work out how much you're going to eat. Whatever you don't want to eat, you just put back in a box. We might not eat it on Pesach. It's obviously permitted to own it. Just put it away in the cupboard and use it some other time after Pesach. It requires very, very little. You just sit at the table. This is Ramosha Feinstein Paskins that this is the optimum way to do this. It's discussed already in the Nodi Yehuda in the 18th century, but that was a theoretical construct because the Nodi Yehuda was writing 100 years before matzah machines were invented, and with the great complexity of making and labor intensivity of making a hand-baked matzah, known as making hand-baked matzah shira. It's really a product of the machine baking era where they can just change the ingredients and produce it very easily. So Moshe Feinstein recommends this solution, and then it becomes very simple, as I said, and this is what we will do. I have done this, I think in 1994, I was still on the bread, but since 2001, based on the Psak ruling of Dayan Lopin Zichron Livrocha, my teacher, based on Moshe Feinstein, we will be eating matzah shira, and I'm just making sure I'm telling you this after I bought mine, in case there's a huge run on matzah, but mine are already sitting up here. I bought them already 6 weeks ago in anticipation that there will be a run on the product, but I'm sure they're still available. It's boxed as egg matzah, but probably in Hebrew it's called matzah shira. Now, the benefits are manifest. You can just eat it at the table, brush it away if you feel you don't, but it's and that's all. And you still have to finish it by 10 o'clock, and it's much, much simpler. There's no Pesach Comet stuff around. And all you have to do before 11 o'clock is take the few crumbs that were left from the burning on Friday morning, flush them down the loo and make the declaration. Whichever of these models you use, it is necessary to daven early. And that means that the shul service will be very early to enable people to have time to come home and still have some kind of minimal meal and about before 10 o'clock. Now, it's compounded by the fact that this year, for the first time in a very long time, not only is erev Pesach on Shabbos, but it's before the clocks change, so that it's an hour earlier. We're davening at 7 o'clock. That was a compromise. My original timetable was earlier. That's how it is. That means we'll be people who want to come to shul will be home by, go fast, 8:45, a little bit further away, 9 o'clock gives people a chance to make kiddush and have breakfast in whichever of these ways and clear away. It is permissible. It is permissible to begin the meal, let's say at 9:30. You don't want to gobble it all up and get rid of it. Complete eating your pitta or matzah and clear away the residue. Flush the remnants down the toilet and then finish the meal without the matzah, even though the time at 10 o'clock has passed. I've noted that on the sheet. That is an option. And these are both, there are a few more details in the sheet, but I don't think it's really necessary to elaborate. Option one has the benefit that you're using bread. It's a more normal thing. Some people are uncomfortable with matzah shir, some people don't like it, some people find it disagrees with them. And if you wanted to be very, very frum about it, which you might, there is a view that there is an obligation to destroy Comets on erev Pesach. The verse says, eliminate. Is that you have an active obligation to eliminate Comets, or it's sufficient to ensure there's no Comets in your home? If you take the former view, this matzah shira shtick doesn't really work. You actually need to actively destroy Comets, which of course you can do by eating it. So there are those who prefer the solution, and I understand that. However, we will not be doing that at home, and we have found, certainly when we've had, in the 20 years since the first time this occurred when we've had children, this has been a good solution, and I recommend it. It's also anxiety-free. All you've got to do is to remember before 11 o'clock to flush the crumbs down the loo and to stop eating your matzah shira by 10 o'clock. These are relatively easy to remember, but it does mean that the davening will be early to facilitate this. So, one or two more details. Of course, this means that you've now finished your Shabbos lunch by 10 o'clock, or even if you let you sleep on a bit, 10:30, if you ate the bread earlier. And it seems unlikely that you're going to want to stop there. It's going to be some time, even though the Seder starts reasonably early, it's still going to be 9 in the evening or so before you get to eat the meal. So it is, of course, permitted during the rest of the day to eat any Pesach food, except for matzah. A question I get asked every year, which I'll address now. People ask, is it permitted to eat products made from matzah meal on erev Pesach? So the answer to this is inevitably there is a disagreement about this subject, but the normative position is as follows. Matzah meal products that are baked like a cake made from matzah meal, are not permitted on erev Pesach. Matzah meal products that are prepared in a way that you could never conceivably, because of the way it could ever fulfill the mitzvah with them, knedlach, for example, which are boiled, fried fish, which is coated in matzah meal, these are permitted. So baked goods forbidden, things that are boiled or cooked in similar ways are permitted. It's likely that one would want to have some more substantial lunch and maybe some other food later in the day. And there is also an obligation to have a third meal, Seudah Shlishit, which of course has got a bit lost in the wash with all this. And one can fulfill Seudah Shlishit in these circumstances with products that do not contain any grain. If you want to be more particular, something more substantial, you could prepare a Pesach cholent with knedlach in it, for example, which would have something more substantial. You can make the bracha mazonos on it, and it's more substantial. This is not an obligation, something you might prefer to do. We've just been discussing this at supper, whether we're going to do that or not. But effectively, remaining food for the rest of the day is solely Pesachdik food, cooked and served in Pesach utensils. And once 10 o'clock's passed and 11 o'clock's passed and you flush, then you have what should be a long, very pleasant, relaxing day where one can do very little and there's very little to do, and hopefully one has a chance to rest. Once Shabbos ends, and we will time the davening so that we will not daven Mariv at nightfall. We will daven Mariv early at shul so that it's possible to get home by nightfall, which is the time then one has to say Baruch Hamavdil ben Kodesh leKodesh, because you're going between Shabbos and Yom Tov. There's a better formulation. And then one can make all the normal preparations, lighting candles, flames from existing flames, and preparing as normal. I think the time, according to Matzo, is 7:14, after which one should start the Seder as soon as is feasible, given that one will have to prepare. I suppose that as a summary, that is it. And so what I'd like to do now, there's been a couple of points made in the chat, is that you can, I've set it up so you can voluntarily unmute yourselves. So I'm going to address any questions that appear in the chat and then ask if there are any questions on this or areas specifically about erev Pesach on Shabbos that I have not covered. So can you please mute all thanks? Okay, we've done that one. Will you be included in the C on the Zoom? We've done that one. For you children eat Matzo Shiur for Seudah on Shabbos. Which Seudah is this, Richard? Do you mean Seudah Shlishis? I think that it depends how old the child is. A child who really is of an age where they understand what's going on and have got some appreciation of the time should not. A smaller child, I would give it to children only till Chatzos, to halachic midday, which is just after 12 and not afterwards. Any other questions? Ruth, please just unmute yourself and speak, Ruth, and then Stuart is unmuting. So go for it. I think Ruth first, but you have to unmute yourself.
Okay. Because I'm ignorant, I don't know the answer to this question. Could you destroy Comets by putting it in disinfectant or bleach?
It's actually a very good question, not at all an ignorant question. The question is addressed in the Gemara. It's a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the other Mishnaic sages as to whether you can only destroy comets using burning or by some other means. The answer is you could, but then what you're going to do with this kind of bleaching mess of comets, I would have thought that flushing it down the loo would be better. If you're talking about on a regular erev Pesach or the Friday this year, with burning, it's always preferable to burn it to accommodate that view. But if for some reason you can't, like you live in a block of flats and you can't, there's nowhere to go and so on, or it's dangerous, then it may be eliminated by some other means. But ideally, it should be burnt unless it's not possible or it's not safe.
Yeah, but this year, obviously, we don't have a choice.
Yeah, well, you burn it on Friday, as I said. You do the burning on Friday morning, leaving a little residue to formally remove by some other means. Yes, you could pour bleach on it, but I think by far the easiest is just to have a little bit of comets left, very small quantities, wrap it in tissue paper and flush it down the toilets. That is the recommended view. It is not an absolute halachic obligation to flush it down the toilet.
May I ask one further question? I noticed when I went shopping that there are shmura matzahs that on the box say shmura, and other boxes say 18-minute matzah. What's the difference?
Shmura matzahs are generally, the word shmura is kind of, I think, misused. All matzah has to be shmura, because if it's not guarded against comets in its production, it's not matzah at all, and you can't use it on Pesach. However, the colloquial use of the word shmura tends to mean that there's been shimur as a supervision from the time the grain is cut, and that matzah is designated for the Seder. That's what it usually means. That means you should use that matzah for the Seder, whether hand-baked or machine-baked, both are acceptable. And that they are for the Seder, and it's not necessary, although many people do, including me, only eat shmura matzah for the whole of Pesach, but it's not a requirement. When it says 18 minutes, I think they're just being frum, because you could have non-shmura matzah that's baked. There is a requirement that from the time the moisture first touches the grain to the process is finished is no more than 18 minutes. I think what they probably mean is that they do an 18-minute batch, and then rather than just continue the production line with other people coming along, and therefore the thing's running continuously, it means they probably stop the machine every 18 minutes, clean it through, and then begin again. I think that's what they mean. Mm-hmm. So they're advertising as a sort of stringency in the way the production line is used. Don't look at what it says in the box, look at the hechsher. If it's a hechsher of an organization you recognize, buy the matzah. If it is not, then don't.
No,
I would ignore what it says.
Because these 18-minute matzot were on the next shelf, or above or below the shelf, with matzahs that definitely on the box said shmura.
Right, so there may well be. There's probably more information if you look at the box more closely.
Okay, thank you.
So without looking at the specific product, I probably can't give a more detailed answer. Stuart, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I might also ask two if I can be cheeky. First one is, with all of this in mind, I picked up a packet of pita bread, got it home, and so it says mazonot on it.
Yes.
Given the rule that generally
bad luck. Bad luck. No. So let me explain. Pita are often made as kind of on the kind of hoof snacks, and therefore they're often made to be mazonot. And therefore, at least in some circumstances, it's not a shiur about that. I think the whole thing's a bit dubious, at least for Ashkenazim. But in some circumstances, you can treat it as a biscuit and not have to wash and bench. That's the point of the exercise. However, everyone will hold if you're kovea suda, meaning you take a product like this, a baked product, and you set it up and you eat it in place of bread at a meal that you still have to wash. So if you think about it, your pita is the same as my Matzo Shiur. It's also the same product. Matzo Shiur, egg matzah, is the Pesachtic version of Mazona's pita. So the same question applies to both, that either you can wash and make a full meal out of it if you use it as part of your meal, a kovea, so you fix your meal over it, or you can't. And the same would apply to either. So the answer is, don't worry about it. If you sit down and you're using it in place of bread and you're washing your hands and you're having a meal, you can treat it as bread, even if it says mazonos on the packet. Your relief, I can see your relief, Stuart. I can see it. Your relief is palpable.
You make hamotzi over it as usual, presumably.
Yes, you treat it just as bread. If you're using it as a bread at a meal, as a bread replacement, right? And what's the other question?
The other question is, can you say again? This may link in, but of course I am Sephardi. I
was looking at you as I was saying it.
Yes, I was slightly confused as to why. I mean, I understand the difference in attitude towards Matzo Shiur, but I can't quite follow through the logic as to what that means you can do, why it means you can have the meal later, and so on. Can you say?
So there's it. Ashkenazim, by long-standing practice, at least 1,000 years, do not eat Matzo Shiur on Pesach, and that means, for our purposes, we stop eating it at the last time to eat Comets in erev Pesach. So for Ashkenazim, it's quite clear. Even if you wanted to use the Matzo Shiur solution, you have to have an early meal, just as if you were eating bread. And the value of eating Matzo Shiur is just more convenient. But you don't gain any time. In most Sephardi communities rule like the other medieval authorities which permit Matzo Shiur on Pesach. And therefore, there's no but since it's not matzah for which you can fulfill the mitzvah of the Seder, there's no prohibition of eating on erev Pesach at all. And therefore, in principle, Sephardim can eat it for the whole of erev Pesach, because the only reason one might not eat it is because of the coming Seder, but it's not relevant because you can't do the Seder, which means, as far as I understand, if you want to use the Matzo Shiur solution, I don't know whether Sephardi halachists recommend it, but in principle, you can just have a regular Shabbos with davening and meals at a normal time, in principle. I don't know whether that's what people do in practice, because unsurprisingly, whenever erev Pesach was fallen on the Shabbos, I've tended to be in my own shul, which I imagine is what people expect of me. But in principle, you can see that the more lenient approach amongst Sephardi halachis to Matzo Shiur means that you can eat it all day. Is that clear?
Yes.
Just as an interest, there's a WhatsApp group of former students of the late Dain Lopian where we discuss halachic issues together, and someone sent a question today about this point, and I remember that it was very clear, but there is actually a Noda B'Yehuda. I mentioned before that Heskel Landau was the Rav in Prague in the mid 18th century, and he says he simply doesn't understand why Ashkenazim can't eat Matzo Shiur for the whole of erev Pesach. He said, okay, all right, it's like our practice not to eat it on Pesach, but it's not Pesach to the evening, and there's no reason to be so stringent. And he said, if I was willing, I would actually say it's permitted to eat Matzo Shiur for Ashkenazim all day, and certainly at least until midday, which is the point at which the biblical prohibition begins. However, convention has not ruled with the Noda B'Yehuda, and so on. That's also why I use the Chatzos Hayom midday as the cutoff point for Richard's question, because there is a strong alternative view that would allow it till midday. It doesn't really help us, because I thought of this. I'm going to tell the whole community to use Matzo Shiur. I'm going to rule like the Noda B'Yehuda, and we're going to, instead of davening at 7, we'll daven at 8. However, since lots of people by family practice or convention or just preference want to use bread, both Ashkenazim and Sephardim, then we have to provide the minyan at an early time to allow those who wish to do it that way to do it that way. So I realized I didn't gain anything. So not much to be gained by taking a more lenient approach about the Matzo Shiur, but I have clarified that point. Are there any further questions on this? I can't actually see everyone because we've got more people on the screen than fit on my iPad. But so there may be one or two people who are waving who I can't see. So if you are asking a question, please unmute yourself and just speak.
Do we have to use 2 complete loaves in inverted commas? And they have to be 2, and do they have to be complete?
The answer is yes. The regular rule of Lechem Mishnah of using 2 whole loaves, which may be matzahs for the Shabbos meals, apply, and that of course means that if you're few in number, there are more benefits of using Matzo Shiur because there's no wastage. Whereas if you have pitta, I was asked this question earlier today by someone, if you're on your own, you take 2 pittas. I mean, you might only want to eat one or half of one. You're going to have to destroy the rest of it. At supper, David Chaim told me a good shtick, which I'm going to report. So I'm not sure whether the person who asked this question earlier in the day is listening, but if you are, then this might speak to you. What happens if you you can't eat 2 pittas? I've got the possibility of having to waste one. So I'll get 3. I'll use 2 on Friday night, put 1 aside for Shabbos morning to have the album, but I've still got a whole uneaten pitta, which I'm basically have to crumble up and flush down the loo. What am I going to do with it? So here is Dover Chaim's suggested solution. Take a Pesachdik matzah, put it in a bag, or if you're feeling anxious, double bag, and use that for your second loaf for Lechem Mishnah for your Shabbos lunch or breakfast. Eat the pitta and put the matzah aside. Unwrap it carefully and put the matzah back in the box of Pesach. Or if you don't feel you want to do that, just put it aside and eat it after Pesach. So that is, I think, an acceptable alternative, because obviously one of our objectives is not just to do this halachically correctly, but to avoid waste. The Matzo Shiur solution avoids waste, and this solution also avoids waste. You can have 1 little pitta for each meal, which without wasting, but you do have to have Lechem Mishnah. Jonathan, is that sorted? Are you sorted?
Yeah, thank you.
Diana.
Some of us bake our own chalot. Would it be okay to make teeny tiny rolls that we just use instead of pita? Yes,
but the 2 observations. One is the reason to use pita is because it doesn't crumble. So it's a practical rather than purely halachic. It's just a suggestion. There is no objection to using bread, but bread crumbles and it's more likely to cause problems. And also there is a minimum size. There's a minimum amount that's called eating bread. And that equates to about the size, let's say, of, I would say, It's about the equivalent to say a half to 2/3 of a very large slice of bread. So something which is like tiny like this, little blob, does not qualify. So it needs to be a reason. It doesn't need to be huge. And a sort of reception roll is much larger than it needs to be. Half of that size is fine.
Thank you.
And so on. So, but in principle, yes, of course you can do that. But it's very tempting to have too much over. And this happens every time. Like, people are laughing at me, like talking about people trying to flush half loaves of bread down the toilet. There'll be someone on this call now who finds himself in this position because they just couldn't. Oh, I've got to make sure we've got enough to eat on Shabbos, and you're going to be at 10:15 on Shabbos morning. What on earth am I going to do with all this leftover bread? So please take this to heart and just manage. Have small amounts of bread. Fill up with other foods, which Pesach foods. Any other questions on this? Caroline, you need to unmute yourself.
You say to chuck it down the loo. Can you not, like, we have... I
said flush it down the loo, actually.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. Flush, chuck, whatever. Yes. Can you not just put it in the bin?
The problem is it's not gone.
But we've got our own, I live in a block of flats, so we have our own bins, and then we have the general bins for all 30 flats right at the other side of the garden. Can I do that?
I think it's debatable at what point it stops being your property. Yes, there are other ways. I'm just trying to think of the simplest way. Not everyone wants to go and wrap it up and then wonder who's owned it, maybe put bleach on it. Why can't you just crumple it down and put it down the loo? I think you're being difficult. But
I just think putting food down the loo.
I'm talking about tiny quantities. If you really don't want to do this, you can pour something on it, you can take it out, but it needs to be in a bin that you're sure that once you've disposed of it, it's no longer your property.
It's no longer my property because it's like
Okay. This is just a recommendation.
All right, I'm sorry. I have another question. Sorry, I came into the shiur a bit late. The Matzo Shiur, is that egg matzo? We can eat that?
Yes, yeah. Matzo Shiur is egg matzo.
Matzo Shiur is egg matzo.
Yeah, Matzo Shiur means enriched matzah. It means matzah that's made with a liquid other than water, fruit juice, or egg, or a combination of honey. That's the stuff we call egg matzah is actually mostly made with apple juice.
Right, I know that.
And it has some egg in it. It's known colloquially as egg matzah, but it's actually really matzah made with apple juice with a bit of egg in it. They are synonymous, but I defined that at the beginning. Egg matzah is Matzo Shiur.
So we can use that for hamotzi on Shabbos.
Yes. Have you got one of these? You've got it in the post. If not, look in your mail out. If not, download it from the shul website. All instructions are here.
I think so.
Well, I've received my own mailing and it was in it. In fact, I took it out of my mail. I took it out of my own mailing. Any other questions? Yes.
Sorry, I'm not going to do this, but could you theoretically get rid of the Comets by either putting it away in the locked cabinet?
No, that you can't do because the sale's already taken place and it excludes the food you've left for Shabbos.
Right.
So no, you can't do that. Okay. Of course, the obvious question that no one's asked is that there is another much easier way of removing the rest of your Comets. You could eat it. What it has to go is disappear. So in theory, the tiny bits of Comets that you left over, you could serve it with your meal and eat it and make the declaration afterwards. You just might not really want to do that.
Or B, could you get a non-Jewish neighbour to come in and take your crumbs away?
I suppose so. But you have to be certain it was understood that it's no longer your property and it's now the property of a neighbour. I suppose so. Although I do think some of the other solutions that have been proposed are rather simpler. And my role is to try to make this simpler. Folks, fine. So okay, fine. I'm receiving the suggestion that he's not made it onto the shul website. I will look into it. I'm not quite sure what's happened there. Okay, we'll sort that out. But you would have received, if you remember the shul, you would have received it in the mail out. I'm just going to have just let me 1 second so I can see what's going on here. Just see what's going on, just check since I keep telling you it's there. Yes, it hasn't. Okay, I'll sort that out. It's just an omission. We'll sort that out. Are there any other, thank you, Gabriel. Are there any other questions specifically about erev Pesach on Shabbos? I have thought about this a lot and tried to create the simplest set of guidelines. Any other questions questions or observations about this? Well, I'll take that it's going to be all very simple and straightforward, and I'll see you at 7 a.m. On Shabbos morning. I will, of course, we've got a very long chazan and an extremely long drosha as well on that occasion. I'm sure you appreciate both. Now, I'm going to be guided by you what to do with this. The primary purpose was to cover the unusual circumstance, and particularly as it hasn't happened since 2008. I could do a whole run through of the pre-Pesach stuff, but I don't think that's necessarily what people want. So what I'm going to suggest, I'm going to pick out a few pointers and then invite questions, which means if there's anything that's bothering you want to ask, there'll be an opportunity. So I think it's important to remember that Comets is not synonymous with dirt, and spring cleaning your home is a good idea, but you don't need to do it this time of the year, and there's so many other things to do, and that bits of dirt on the floor, things behind bookcases, unexplained objects in your garden do not have to be investigated. You do not have to clean for Pesach in rooms you never take food. We do not take food into the upstairs of our house. We do no Pesach cleaning at all in the upstairs of the house. We do not do B'dikas Comets in the upstairs of our house. That doesn't suit everyone, but it's just illustrative that this is perhaps a way of making life easier. When products contain comets, then if they're edible, they remain a problem. You're not allowed to own them, and you're not allowed, certainly not allowed to eat them. But that is presuming that the product itself is edible. So things like shoe polish, glue, and other things are not edible. Therefore, they may be used. Shampoo is another example. Many people use wheat germ shampoo, which clearly has some Comets ingredients. This product may be owned and used during Pesach because it is not edible. On the other hand, when it comes to medications, liquid medication needs to be Comets free, and there are lists available. And for those who struggle with very specific medication, I have the email address of an expert whom one can contact to talk about this. But when medication is swallowed whole, tablets, this is not considered eating. The product is not halachically edible, and all medication that can be swallowed whole without chewing is permitted. That's it. All medication, doesn't matter what's in it. Doesn't matter if it's got Comets, pig fat, it makes no difference. This is not considered to be eating. I get very often asked about medication that may contain Comets, and I get asked very often about medication that contains glycerine, which is very often comes from a non-kosher source. If the medication is swallowed whole as a pill or a capsule, these are not halachic issues. I can assure you that thank God I very rarely take medication, but when I do not look at the ingredients. It's of no interest. It's not a halachic concern at all if it's swallowed whole. It's prohibited not just to eat Comets with a very strict prohibition, one of the strictest in the Torah, and it's also prohibited to own or derive any benefit from Comets, hence the requirement to get rid of Comets altogether, or to sell it in a particular way to a non-Jew. That's usually arranged by the rabbi, that also means that Comets that has been owned inadvertently or perhaps willfully during Pesach is not permitted after Pesach, and therefore it makes good sense to ensure that you get rid of it, particularly as you make it so very easy to do so. When it comes to koshering, I do not propose to go through a long list of how to kosher. We are not able, for COVID reasons, to provide a regular koshering service this year. It's unfortunate that it's the second year, but the prospect of having people crammed into a kitchen and queuing up, we can't do that. It's not safe, and I've decided, I'm sure, and I hope you agree with this ruling, that I know it's a service that people value, but I'm afraid that we can't provide it. And hopefully, please God, another year. I noticed there are some questions coming in the chat. When I finish this bit, then I will look at the questions and answer them. The basic rules are that some materials can be koshered, some can't be koshered, and some do not need to be koshered. We're probably by now familiar that wood, stone, metal, glass can be koshered in various ways, and most other materials cannot. There's a discrete discussion about what to do with plastics. If there's a specific question, then ask me. Generally, things are left for 24 hours without being used and then koshered in a particular method, either by boiling, pouring boiling water, or in some cases heating, depending on what the material is. these are things which are familiar from every year. And if you have specific questions, then ask them when I finish this section. In fact, I'm actually going to pause there. I'm going to look at the questions in the chat and then see if there are any questions from the audience. So may you take vitamin pills? If you feel that you need them, then it's permitted to take them. Yes, it's permitted. They're swallowed whole, just take them. Did I make reference to washing up liquid? I did not make a reference to washing up liquid. Washing up liquid is something which I've never really understood why one would want to buy washing up liquid with a Heir. Washing up liquid is not edible. And the definition of edibility for Pesach is achilas kelev, that a dog would eat it. So we go a little further than just human edibility, which is the biblical threshold. We lower the threshold to edibility by an animal, by a dog. I think it is extraordinarily improbable that a dog would eat washing up liquid. And anyway, we don't eat washing up liquid. It's put on things, it's washed off, and then, in fact, if you leave traces of washing up liquid on your plate, the food tastes disgusting. And so, in my view, it is permissible to use any washing up liquid at any time of the year, including Pesach, and we just buy ordinary washing up liquid for Pesach. And I suggest you do likewise. Of course, if there's anyone here who on this call who manufactures kosher washing up liquid, this might upset them, for which I make no apologies. There is a question from Gillian Freeberger: do we need kosher toothpaste? So toothpaste is somewhat different. It goes in your mouth and it clearly has a pleasant flavor. It's made to have a pleasant flavor. And one can debate whether this can be considered a part of eating. One would not ordinarily put in one's mouth anything that has a pleasant flavor and you're swilling it around in the mouth and so on. So I think that you need to take guidance from the kashrut list for this. Please mute yourself if that's you. There are supervised toothpaste, and I will admit to buying supervised toothpaste for Pesach. I think there also are toothpaste that are listed as, or there certainly used to be, that are let's say, are free of Comets ingredients. If you're assured it's free of Comets ingredients, then it's permitted even without a Heir. So the answer is you need to make sure it's kosher, but it does not need to have a supervision, providing you're assured that it does not contain any Comets ingredients. I don't really know what to, please mute yourself. Okay, I'm gonna do it for you. I don't actually know what toothpaste is made from, and I rather think I don't want to know. But if you can establish that it's free of Comets ingredients, I don't care if it's got kitnius in it, not interested in that. If it's free of Comets ingredients, then it's permitted to use. If you can't establish, then buy the one with the supervision. We put it away each year. Tube lasts 6-7 years. I mean, you do have to kind of dig out the top at the beginning of each year, because it gets a bit hard.
Rabbi Belowski,
yeah, Brian.
Can I ask a question? I take a great deal of medication. One of them, which is a pill which I swallow whole, is shown on the based-in list as not suitable for Pesach. And my doctor, who is halachically aware, prescribes me an alternative medication.
Right. This sounds like being interesting when I go for my customary visits to Angeli on Cholamoid. That might sound like an interesting topic of conversation. My understanding, based on the Tshuva and the Chazon Ish, of which I have formally always based my rulings for this, and I know the late Rabbi Feldman in Munks also based his ruling on this Chazon Ish, certainly in the later years, after he changed his view on this matter, is that medication that is swallowed whole is not subject to any of these din and is permitted. There is clearly an alternative view, but I don't think I understand it.
I just thought I'd let you know that, so that you're aware of
Thank you. I suppose that you could argue that if there's an alternative that is easily available without any problem, which is safe and can be procured easily, why not have it? But certainly, if you were to say to me, I don't know what to do, there is no alternative, I would have no hesitation telling you to take the regular one. Maybe you didn't want to hear that, since you've gone out of your way to get an alternative. Any other questions on what we've said, or anything that's outstanding so far? When I say outstanding, I don't mean it was marvelous. I mean it's unresolved. Is someone waving? You have to, if you're going to speak, you need to unmute yourself.
Can you say something about the your timing as regards Greenwich Mean Time and British Summer Time over the weekend?
Yes, so you will have noticed that, as I mentioned briefly, the beginning of Pesach is before the clocks change while we're still on GMT. BST begins early Sunday morning, which will be, for most people, soon after their first Seder, which causes some confusion because we are now in a situation where the clocks have changed, but it isn't permissible to change a clock. Yet lots of people have watches and clocks that change automatically. Plenty of kitchen clocks are radio operated and they just change automatically. And the last time this occurred, which was nearly 30 years ago, the world was somewhat different. And there are communities that have taken, I can see there are 3 approaches. And I discussed this with Brian some months ago, and he advocated a solution other than the one that I've adopted. I'd just like to put it on the table before I answer. Although attempting, I must say, as his solution was, I didn't feel it was very realistic in the current milieu. Option 1 is to urge everyone simply to remain on GMT till Monday night. Just ignore it, change your clock on Monday night. However, I did feel that given we have a community of mixed level observance and many people's clocks change automatically, while it is attractive, of course, because then you don't lose the extra hour between early Sunday morning and doubling on Sunday morning. I felt that this was not really, this was the solution that Brian advocated, which I believe one of the schools locally is using. I think that if you're in a homogeneous religious community, it's probably easier to do. Alternative would be, and there's a community in Hendon, I just saw their timetable, to urge everyone to change to BST before Shabbat and have the entire Yom Tov on BST. But that, for me, means you lose the benefit of the fact for the first time in a long time, you can start the Seder before 7:30. Most years it's an hour later because nightfall, at least on the first night. So I didn't like that solution either. And again, it has the same problem that clocks change automatically, and we do not live in a homogeneous community. And the one, it is not permitted to actively change your watch or a clock on Shabbos and Yom Tov. One needs to be realistic that we have a community where not everyone will follow that, and we are likely to cause confusion, chaos, and I think probably more than a little bit of a few angry people have turned up to shul an hour late or an hour early. Although I'm not sure whether the person concerned is on, but I will not name him. Someone did come today an hour early for Mincha and seems to be practicing for the Yom Tov weekend. Now, you'll be pleased to hear that he did come back an hour later at the right time. So I came to the conclusion that we had no option, or I felt that the best way to do it was simply to go with the flow, meaning that acknowledge that people are thinking in GMT until late on Saturday night, and from Sunday morning until Monday night when Yom Tov ends, they're thinking in BST, and to produce a timetable that reflects this, but to put the other time in brackets grayed out so you can refer to it. So you'll see that the times for the beginning and the timetable are scheduled for GMT with BST in brackets, and from Sunday morning they're in BST with the GMT in brackets. And it might take a bit of time to get your head around it. I thought about it very carefully, and I hope it's intelligible. But that is how it works. I've not so far had any kushas on it. I just hope that I will turn up on Sunday morning at the right time, and I haven't been kind of fooled by my own timetable, and B, not to discover that everyone else is there rather than they've come an hour earlier or they're coming an hour later, whichever way around it will be. So that's how I've timetabled it in this very unusual circumstance, and I hope that it's possible to follow.
So there would be no objection for someone like me who doesn't come to shul and therefore can ignore those times to stay on GMT and begin the second Seder early.
None whatever. Ultimately, it's not early. You can't start the second Seder until nightfall.
Right.
Whether you call it time A or time A+1, it really is, that's nomenclature. If you're at home and doing your own thing and not to a community timetable, then it's completely unobjectionable. You will not be starting your Seder at a time different from anyone else, Brian. You're just calling it something different. It's completely unobjectionable. Please do. And in fact, my notes say I recognise there are those who would prefer to stay on GMT, those who prefer to be on BST, and those who will manage it. I'm intending to have a second clock in my dining room, which I will keep covered until Sunday morning, and then uncover it, and we will refer to this clock for the rest of Yom Tov. Hopefully, it will work. None of these are very genius or high tech solutions, and it's of course not a clock that changes automatically. But there's no objection. If you want to keep stay on GMT for the rest of the year, Brian, it's entirely up to you. As long as you bring Shabbos in soon before sunset and take it out around nightfall, it doesn't really matter what you call it. And it's also interesting what an extraordinarily clever device this changing the clocks is, because nothing actually changes. It's just that we are persuaded to call it something different. We still are having the Seder at dark, whatever we call it. But yes, thank you. I did think about your solution. It is appealing, but I just felt it wasn't going to work in our community. But I have seen already. I noticed that in Rabbi Tugendhaf's shul in Hendon, I looked at his timetable and I thought, Shabbos morning 7:30. That's pushing it. Then I realised that he's gone forward an hour, and his end time is half an hour earlier than ours. And so that he's actually starting earlier than us. So anyway, I found it immensely confusing. Are there any other questions on what we said so far? Richard, you sent something in the chat here. What is this about sorbitol? Just pause it. Yes, Jackie, just a second. Just finish this point. Richard, what is this point about sorbitol?
Apparently, the ingredient in toothpaste, which is Comets stick, is something called sorbitol. And so the Beth Din have put together a list of products which are not supervised, but which they have researched and do not contain sorbitol. So some common brands like Colgate, etc., are on that list, should people wish to look.
Great, that's fine. That's the answer. The answer is if they're on that list, it's permitted to use them. There's no need to follow on supervision. There's a question from Jackie, and then I've got a question in the chat from Mayor Malinsky. Jackie.
Just to ask you, there's going to be a problem with setting your time switch, isn't it? The lights.
Just start again. Sorry, Jackie, just pause a second. Someone called me and it interrupted the signal. So can you just start the question again, please? I switched it off, but it's
yes. When you set your time clock for the lights to come on and off, that's going to be quite a problem, isn't it? Because it's going to have to be done for British summertime.
Fortunately, I'm a rabbi, not an electrician. So I'm afraid
it doesn't matter about that. But what happens?
I just think you just have to take into consideration that you might need an extra hour.
Yeah, exactly.
If anyone's got any response specifically to this, I think Michael Bear is offering a solution to this problem.
Yeah, if you set your time clock for Shabbos, it will carry on its 24-hour cycle for Sunday and Monday. So it won't make any difference at all. You might be on a different time, but the time clock is still on whatever hour it was on before. So it's still working on a 24-hour basis. And
sure, but you've got to make sure it goes off later because of Seder and things.
Oh, so you have to set it
normally.
You have to set it
but you do that anyway.
You've got to set it so that it goes on longer.
Yes, you have to set it so it goes off later on Friday night, so that on Shabbos night, yes. But otherwise, you don't have to worry about the hour.
Oh no, I'm not thinking that. I'm just thinking you've got to make sure you remember when you set it that you're going to be an hour later on.
You need to set your lights. So you need to set your lights to go off later, so there's enough time for the Seder. Yeah, yes, that's fine. Okay.
Exactly.
There is, thank you for that. There's a question in the chat from Mayor Malinsky. How can you kosher a Shabbat plate, especially considering the electric wiring part? So the first thing with any electric device is to remember that safety comes first. You used to see ridiculous directions about covering all parts of the inside of an oven with sort of foil, covering the vents, covering the airflow through the trays. This is just idiotic, and you're asking for trouble. Any covering of any kind of product or koshering, you must make sure that it's safe, and if it can't be done safely, obviously don't do it. So with that caveat, one needs to be cautious with hot plates, because hot plates are not intended to be used covered, and some varieties, you cover it in sort of foil, there's a risk it will reflect the heat back to the device and possibly onto the work surface below, and that can be dangerous. So experiment with it or ask the manufacturer if it's safe to do that. If it isn't safe to do it, then clean it as best you can. Cover it with some kind of, perhaps a very thin layer of silver foil, again, if that's safe. Or find perhaps, or stand the Pesach pot on, let's say, on a silver foil tray that's been flattened, which has just been served. So you can use the pot without it touching the silver foil tray, but without touching the hot plate directly, but without covering the whole thing. Whether it's safe, I've had varying reports. Some people say it's completely safe to cover a hot plate. It might depend on the type, and others are saying that it's dangerous. I recall a long time ago, it must have been 20 or 25 years ago, not so long we were married, that I think we had an accident with a hot plate, which I think was probably what it reminded me of this. And so take care. You cannot pour boiling water, obviously, over the electric part. And I'm not sure there's much point in pouring water over a hot plate anyway. So clean it thoroughly. And if you can't cover it safely, but you still want to use it for Pesach, get one of those silver foil platters that are used for sort of serving things, and just put it on the hot plate and stand the thing on top of it, because that will avoid covering it. Again, experiment before Pesach to make sure that it works to conduct the heat, but it also is safe. Next question. This is your last call. If you have a question, please ask. Otherwise, I am going to just say a little bit about the mitzvahs of the Seder, and then I'm going to end. There are 4 mitzvahs to observe at the Seder. 2 are biblical and 2 are rabbinic. The biblical ones are eating matzah and telling the story of the Exodus, Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, and the two rabbinic ones are the 4 cups of wine and eating moror. So although the Torah refers to moror, it only refers to it in the context of eating the Pesach offering. So in the non-temple times, there's no biblical mitzvah to eat moror, only a rabbinic one. And those mitzvahs are all done after nightfall. This year, the first night straightforward. It's after Shabbos anyway. The second night's a little later. The mitzvahs are, I'll go through them one at a time. The mitzvah of eating matzah is a mitzvah to eat the matzah. We eat it 3 times, motzi matzah, korech, and afikomen. Each time one should. It's not a nibble, it's eating, but it doesn't need to be a gigantic amount. There are people, I think, who get, let's say, over zealous about this. The quantity of matzah that is required is probably, well, it's about, of a normal thickness matzah is about the size of an adult hand without the thumb. So I'd say it's less than half of a Rekuzen's matzah in terms of size, probably not much more than a third each time. So you're looking at, over the whole evening, having to eat maybe a matzah and a third, a matzah and a half, which is probably less than most people at breakfast. When it comes to telling the story, it's not a prayer. There's no person telling a story in a way people don't understand, using an archaic translation, make it engaging, exciting, interesting, and a story-like in terms of engagement, dramatize if it's appropriate for the audience, depending on their age and level of knowledge. It doesn't need to be dry, boring, and unengaging. It can be discursive. And there are hundreds of Haggadahs. I think the Haggadah remains, perhaps after the Bible, the most printed Jewish book, with new editions coming out every year. There's always something interesting to see. When it comes to moror, moror, again, it has to be a kazai, so kind of an olive bulk. But that does seem that ancient olives were rather larger than modern olives, So when it comes to, if you use lettuce, a thick stalk lettuce, which is the optimum, we're talking about using perhaps two leaves or two stalks. Using horseradish, it's quite a lot. It's about worked out to be about 2/3 of an ounce. What many people do, certainly we do, European Jews never use lettuce because it wasn't available. There's no question that it's halachically preferable. It's also much easier to eat than horseradish. But horseradish has that sort of flavor, which is so reminiscent of the, grandparent Seder that I certainly, while I eat lettuce for the mitzvah, I can't quite do without it. And so we do a bit of both. bit of horseradish into the lettuce as well. And when it comes to the 4 cups, again, it's a celebration. It's not a little sip. A sherry glass, let's say, that holds 90 milliliters is only about this big, and is more than is adequate. But one should drink the whole cup. If one can't drink wine, then mix it with grape juice or just drink entirely grape juice. And I know I've said this every year, but it's just worth saying again, as long as the wine is kosher, it is entirely fine for this mitzvah. If you happen to like dry white wine, use that. You don't have to drink Kiddush wine unless you particularly like it, in which case drink it with pleasure. But there's no requirement to drink. There's no mitzvah of drinking palwin. The mitzvah of drinking palwin was invented by the people who make palwin, rather than having any basis. And I can assure you there were no French Jews in the medieval period who drank palwin. They drank French wine, and you can too, or might you prefer Israeli wine. Other than that, I think that I'm probably finished. Are there any questions about Seder preparations? I've covered erev Pesach in detail. I've done a little run through of some of the core dinim of Pesach. I've taken questions. I've talked you through basic rules about the mitzvahs at the Seder, and I will repeat some of this stuff anyway on Shabbos morning, and briefly, as I always do. It's not actually Shabbos I've got all this week, but no one wants to hear me at 8 o'clock on Shabbos morning when it's Pesach that evening, telling you how to prepare for Pesach. That is, of course, a purposeless exercise. So I'll do it this week. Are there any outstanding questions?
Could you just repeat again what you said about the lettuce and the size of the lettuce, please? Because you talked about long leaf lettuce, but there's all different sorts of lettuces.
Yes. So long leaf lettuce is called romaine lettuce. The romaine lettuce. It's available in every supermarket, and they tend to have quite thick stalks. And really, since you're looking at volume, the leaf itself, it actually contributes very little of the volume, but a lot of the volume is contributed by the stalk. So I would say that 2 medium-sized leaves with thickish stalks is about the right amount. If you want to go down to the mimetic tradition about how in litter they used to measure this, we don't use these measuring charts. This was invented by someone in New York. The Matzo is measured against the hand, and the lettuce, the way we measure it is I put the lettuce across my hand, and I close my fingers over the lettuce. If it closes very easily, insufficient. If it's too hard to close it, too much. If it closes just about right, that's about the amount. And you'll see, you can't really see it as you're on Zoom, that the amount that will go in there is probably about 2 stalks worth. And that, according to Dialopian, was how, in the Lithuanian tradition, as you use lettuce, that's how you measure lettuce. And this is part of, of a kind of a world of measuring things in a kind of more human terms rather than like weighing them or or measuring them against charts. I do have one of those sheets, but I haven't used it for 25 years, and maybe this year I'll throw it away.
Thank you.
Because my children now know how to do this too, without resorting to very extreme or absurd sizes based on measurements. Any other questions? Well, Michael, I'll see you in the morning anyway. So got any further questions, you've got the opportunity to ask. Anyone else wants to ask a question related to what we've said? It's still more than a week till Pesach. You can send me an email, give me a call. I'm around, of course. Okay, in which case, it wasn't bad. It was an hour and a quarter, so we did not hit the target. 75 rather than 90. I don't see you. Have a wonderful and kosher Pesach. Looking forward to gradually seeing each week there are more and more people at shul. It's lovely to see them, as you get vaccinated and feel more confident with the environment, do gradually start to return. Look forward to seeing everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Good night, good night, good night, good night, good night.
Good night.